Well, thank you for that wonderful. I think that was for you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. What a great, great audience we have here today for a very distinguished speaker. As each of you know, this is the Conservative Women's Network Luncheon. And we're always thrilled when we have conservative men join us. Welcome to you too, gentlemen. This is December, and we have a tradition with the Conservative Women's Network that each December we find an outstanding gentleman, a distinguished gentleman, a gentleman leader who should be invited to speak to our ladies and any gentlemen who happen to join us. And this year we've had a few gentlemen in this country who've done really outstanding things to advance conservative principles and values. But we decided to pick a really good one to come and talk to you today. Now this gentleman over the weekend I think was trapped in his home state of Utah due to some inclement weather, and probably not Utah weather, probably East Coast weather. But nevertheless, he got back here in time to engage over on Capitol Hill on some very important activities, and perhaps we'll hear from him about those in his remarks, or if not, in the Q&A, because he's told us he would be happy to answer some questions. Our speaker today is, as you well know, because you so graciously applauded him as he walked in the room, is Senator Mike Lee from the great state of Utah. He was elected to the Senate in 2010. He's the 16th senator from Utah. And for those of you who are counting, many states have had more than 16 senators, but this is a good beginning. He is well known in conservative constitutional circles as someone who understands the founding of this country and the founding documents. He's well grounded in understanding the founding principles that led us to becoming a great nation. It's wonderful to have that kind of a voice in the United States Senate. He graduated from Brigham Young University. He had his degree in political science. I don't know if that bodes well for all political science majors, but we have a great intern class represented here today, and I suspect many of them are political science majors, so you'll give them encouragement. He then went on to law school and graduated from BYU's law school. I will say parenthetically, he began his political career at BYU because he was the student body president. So he got a good start on shaking hands and giving a good message of optimism to students. He has clerked at several courts, and he also clerked for Judge Sam Alito on the Court of Appeals, and then was able to also clerk for him when he was a justice of the Supreme Court. So that's a great relationship that he developed through his career. He served in the private sector working for a law firm. Many of us know that in Washington, working for a law firm doesn't necessarily mean you're working for the private sector, but you're always interacting with government. But nevertheless, the lawyer business still is a private sector employment. And then he has also served in state government. He served in the government of Utah under Governor Jon Huntsman. He was elected to the United States Senate, somewhat of a surprise to many people. He made a commitment to the people of Utah that he would come back here and make a difference for the things that have made our country great. He has not disappointed the people of Utah, nor the rest of us in this country. So on behalf of the Clare Boothe Luce Institute, which co-sponsors this luncheon with us every month, Senator Lee, let me welcome you to the Heritage Podium.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's always a little bit intimidating to speak to any group of women as the male outsider coming in. But I will say, anytime I see a banner like that behind me, when it says Conservative Women's Network, I feel a little bit at home. Let me explain what I mean by that. I have 5 sisters. My wife also has 5 sisters. Between us, it's a lot of sisters. And they're all conservative. And so I like to think that I have a certain head start with regard to relating to conservative women. And so I feel, in many respects, right at home in a group like this, and I'm honored to be here with you. It's a very interesting time to be in the Senate, and it's a challenging time for our country. It's scary in many, many respects. We face an overwhelming set of burdens. I nonetheless believe that our best days ahead of us remain yet ahead of us as Americans, and I think we can make that happen. And it's with that end in mind that I'd like to direct my remarks today. You know, there is a certain natural tendency that I think exists almost unavoidably between, on the one hand, a party's political leadership, and on the other hand, the base that exists, the core base, the grassroots movement people on the ground level. The base tends to want action, and they tend to want action fast, often much faster than the political leadership thinks that it can deliver. But, you know, there really does have to exist something of a trust between the base and the political leadership, and there has to exist a relationship of cooperation between the base and the political leadership if we're going to bring about the changes that we want. Today, the trust between the political leadership and the base does not exist, at least not nearly to the degree that it could and that it should. And in fact, some recent efforts that we've had and that we've seen have, in the minds of many, widened the already existing gap between the base and the political leadership. It's a significant gap, and it's a gap that we've got to bridge. As I see it, that gap between the base and the political leadership today within the Republican Party is exactly the size and exactly the shape of a conservative reform agenda, something that we can unite behind, something that consists of a set of principles that we can work toward proactively, affirmatively, together in order to advance. It's easy for us to neglect the need to unite behind an affirmative conservative reform agenda, especially when we don't have the majority in the Senate and we don't occupy the White House. That puts us unavoidably in a position of having to say no a lot, and I make no apology for that. We will continue to say no, and we will continue to say no aggressively to everything that attempts to expand this government size, scope, reach, and cost. And we must do this, and we must never back down, and we will not. At the same time, we have to avoid getting caught in that loop of the perpetual no. Our yes button has to work, at least in the sense that we've got to be able to identify those things that we're for, so that when we are in power, we'll be ready to go, and we'll know what it is that we're pushing for. There's a parallel between our current state of affairs and what we faced as a movement in 1976. Now, I was only 5 years old at the time, but I was nonetheless somewhat politically aware. As a 5-year-old during the 76 election, my mom once overheard me chanting Carter. I don't know where this came from, but I had good parenting, and I was immediately corrected. I must have heard a group of people downtown in Washington chanting that my family lived in the D.C. area at the time, and it never, ever happened again. So, 76. We found a leader for the ages in the conservative movement, in Ronald Reagan. We ran him against an establishment, less conservative Republican president named Gerald Ford. Ultimately, we lost that bid. We lost that primary election. And at the end of that primary election fight, and at the end of that general election fight that season, the party found itself in a state of disarray and discouragement, understandably. There were a lot in the party that said, you know, you ruined it, you messed it up. You found this great conservative guy, but he couldn't win the primary, and then you damaged the incumbent, and now we're all worse off, and all we did was lose more seats in Congress. Well, that was only the beginning of the story, and of course the rest of the story would unfold in 1980, when we took that conservative leader for the ages and we got him elected president of the United States, and with him we got more Republicans elected to Congress. And so what was the difference? I think we have to ask that question. Why were we able to do that in 1980 when we weren't in 1976? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons had to do with the fact that we formed a message. We formed an agenda. We found the right leader. But between that gap between 1976 and 1980, we were able to coalesce as a party around a conservative reform agenda that helped unite us. And so I think our key today is to find our agenda so that when we get not only to 2014 but also to 2016, we can identify to the people what it is that we're for. We can put our leaders for the ages forward, and they'll have something to grasp onto, something that will appeal, something that will help us win elections, and something that will be entirely consistent with our conservative principles. So what is it that a conservative reform agenda would look like? I think it's got to have a few characteristics. First, it's got to be comprehensive. I think we have to tackle fiscal issues, defense issues, and to some extent, of course, social issues. They don't necessarily come up within the federal government as often as they do within the states, but social issues necessarily do come up from time to time within the federal government, and we've got to address those as we need to. We need to have a number of proposals to deal with our country's challenges in those areas. Second, it must be conservative. It must not be the least bit apologetic. It must not shy away in the least from our commitment to maintain constitutionally limited government. Our policies have to reduce the size and the scope and the cost of the federal government in a manner that's consistent with the oaths that those of us who serve in federal office have taken to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution. And finally, it must address the aspirations of all Americans and speak directly to the greatest challenge of our time, which I believe is America's opportunity crisis. So I think that what's made America great is the fact that this is a land of economic opportunity. It always has been. It's why people want to move here from all over the world. It's why we've become a nation of immigrants, and that's a wonderful thing. All of us in the room, if not immigrants ourselves, are most likely the descendants of immigrants. And the reason for this was this has always been a land where you could be born poor and die wealthy. Think of the wealthy people you know. Most of them, almost all of them, can remember a time when their own family was poor. That's not the case in most parts of the world. But right now, we've got an opportunity crisis in America that we've got to address, and it exists at three levels. It exists, first of all, with immobility among the poor. Today, for the first time in American history, for the first time since any kind of statistics like these have been kept, a child born today has a 42% chance of remaining in the bottom quintile of the American economy if at the time of his birth he's born into the bottom quintile. You're born into the bottom 20%, 43% chance of staying there for the duration of your life. This is un-American. It's unacceptable. And there are reasons why this is happening more today. And I believe a lot of those reasons have everything to do with federal policy, poverty traps that we put in place that actually make many of the same social welfare programs that are supposed to be alleviating the hardships of the poor are keeping people trapped in poverty, and this has got to change. We've got insecurity within the middle class, where people work really hard to try to provide for the basic needs of their families. And yet they find that whenever they get a little extra income, which these days seems to happen all too infrequently, no sooner have they received it than they find that that income has quickly been gobbled up by a nasty combination of excessive taxation, costs that have been passed down to them through excessive government regulation, which currently costs our economy $2 trillion a year, and contrary to what many in the government and business establishment would have you believe, those costs are not borne by wealthy fat cats on Wall Street or in the industrial sector. Those costs are borne by the middle class and by the poor, who just pay higher prices for goods and for services, and they pay for that in terms of diminished wages and unemployment when they're not paying higher prices. So you've got this insecurity in the middle class where they're finding it harder and harder to get up. Finally, the opportunity crisis manifests itself at the top end as well with cronyist privilege. Those who have achieved the highest rungs of the economic ladder find themselves in a position where, with the assistance of the government, they in effect pull up the ladder from behind them, making it harder from those beneath them to climb their way up. And they do this not only with government subsidies, where the government picks winners and losers in business and subsidizes them. Think of Solyndra as one of many examples. Think of our policies with regard to sugar and its importation as another example. Also think about excessive regulation. Excessive regulation, after all, is the best friend of big business, even though big business will often crow about it. Because what better, what more natural restriction on entry is there than a system of federal regulation that costs our economy $2 trillion a year? Unless you're a big company, think of General Electric, with an army of lawyers and accountants and lobbyists, it's really difficult to comply with today's morass, today's network of federal regulations, which, by the way, are increasing at a rate of 77,000 pages a year. Last year, by comparison, we passed about 1,500 pages of law in Congress. 77,000 pages. That was the size of last year's Federal Register. So government programs are adding to these problems by making life a lot harder for the first two groups, the middle class and for the poor, and by protecting the last group. That's where we turn back to conservatism for the solution. Our principles and our policies that will flow from our principles provide, I believe, the best solutions to these problems. And a conservative reform agenda would tackle these problems head on. But I need your help with three things as we move forward with this. First, I need you to contribute your ideas to the conservative reform agenda. You know, one day fairly soon, I believe, the Republican Party may well unite behind a single conservative health care reform plan. But today, we don't need one. Today, we need 10 or more. We need a lot so that these can compete in the marketplace of ideas. Because now that Obamacare has been funded past the first of the year, it's there. And we've got to have something to put in its place. We've got to have something that will replace it. We've got to have something that's built on conservative principles and not on a statist agenda that necessitates the perpetual expansion of the federal government to put in its place. The same goes with plans and policies and proposals in areas ranging from education, transportation, marriage, taxes, energy, and so on and so forth. I've introduced in recent weeks legislation dealing with many of these, but we need more ideas. We need a great debate within our party. And whatever it is that your organization might promote or that you might have ideas regarding, we need those ideas. Second, I need your voices. Our conservative movement desperately needs the voices of more Americans, especially women, calling out the government for making life worse for so many Americans, the same Americans that it purports to be helping as it reaches out its all-powerful hand and often ends up hurting the very people that it purports to help. Third, I need you to help get the country engaged. Help engage your friends, your neighbors, your aunts, your uncles, even the annoying ones that show up to family Christmas parties. Get them involved, help them understand the relationship between America's economic opportunity crisis and the perpetual federal overreach that we've seen. Tell them why it is that your conservative reform proposals, your conservative reform ideas will make life better for everyone. Ultimately, I am reminded often of the term compassionate conservatism. From the moment I first heard that term, it caused me a certain unsettled feeling. I couldn't figure out why, and I ultimately concluded that it bothered me because it's redundant. Conservatism is compassionate by its very nature. It's like saying a loving marriage It's like saying a good friendship. These are things that are redundant and should be. Conservatism, properly understood, is for the common man. It's for the benefits of the poor. It is for creating an environment in which everyone can thrive, everyone can prosper. In short, we as conservatives believe in freedom. And we believe in freedom not just because freedom in the abstract is a good idea, which it is. But the reason it is a good idea is because of what happens when free individuals remain free and as free citizens are allowed to form communities. And those communities tend to be marked by two things: free market economies and voluntary institutions of civil society. And when individuals are allowed to be free and they form communities where they have free markets and voluntary institutions of civil society, that's where the human condition thrives. That's where human beings do their best work. That's where the needs of the poor are best taken care of. That's where people come to understand that the conservative vision is much, much more than an Ayn Rand novel. It's a Norman Rockwell painting. It's a Frank Capra film with a little looking out for the other fellow. It's something that involves the thriving of the human condition, a condition that cannot exist where government imposes its heavy hand. Now, these components of freedom, voluntary institutions of civil society, and free markets, cannot be created by the government. When government tries to create them, it just causes problems. When government gets too involved, the muscles of the free market and of the civil society start to atrophy, and we can't succeed in doing what we need to do. And once these institutions are destroyed, they can't easily be restarted. They take hundreds, if not thousands of years to come into existence with free individuals. And so we've got to protect them. So our challenge today is to move toward the kind of government we want. We as a base do have a practice, and it is a good one, it is a necessary one, of complaining against the kind of government we do not want, the kind of government that we reject. We're good at that as Americans. We started it not in 2009 or 2010, we started it in 1773 when we boarded some ships in Boston Harbor and we threw off the tea and we demonstrated that we're not willing to tolerate the kind of oppressive national government that then existed in London and lorded over us. It took us 14 years to get from Boston to Philadelphia, where we went from just protesting against the kind of government we did not want to embracing and identifying and articulating the characteristics of the kind of government we did want. We don't have 14 years this time. We've got to act faster than that. We've got to move along this road from Boston to Philadelphia much faster. The 1976 model is a good one for us, not just the 1776 or the 1773 model or the 1787 model. Let's follow the 1976 to 1980 model. Let's get ready and let's make that happen even faster this time. Let's move forward a conservative reform agenda that is for the common man and the common woman, that is for the American family, that is for free markets and voluntary institutions of civil society. As we do this with the United States Constitution as our guide, that singular document that has fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known, we will discover that our greatest days are yet ahead of us as Americans. We're all in this together, and I invite you to join me in this noble cause. May God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Okay, the senators agreed to take some questions, and while Michelle Easton is not with us today, I'm going to turn that opportunity to direct the questioning over to her able colleague here. Come right on and identify folks.
Sure. Anybody have a question that they would like to ask? Just raise your hand, and we have two of our Heritage Foundation interns are going to bring the microphone to you if you'll just wait till they get to you. We have one in the back here standing.
Thank you. I'm Emily Goff here at Heritage. I do transportation policy. Wondering if you could speak a little bit about the Transportation Empowerment Act that you co-introduced not too long ago, just what your vision is for that legislation and the policies in it.
Yes, happy to do that. Thank you very much for asking about that. This is one of the pieces of the conservative reform agenda that I've been forming that I'm most proud of. Currently, part of our economic opportunity crisis relates to the lack of availability of affordable housing. Now, when a lot of people in Washington hear that, they think, oh, good, more subsidies, more government spending. I see it quite the opposite way. I see a lot of our dearth of affordable housing related to the fact that we've got land in many of America's cities and communities that is available to be developed and could be developed for housing, but it's just not as accessible as it needs to be. We need infrastructure to get there. But right now, we've got too much of our transportation infrastructure money tied up in Washington. So currently, the federal gasoline tax is 18.4 cents per gallon. My bill would reduce that to 3.7 cents per gallon. That 3.7 cents per gallon would be dedicated toward maintaining our existing interstate highway system, which is appropriately considered federal. But it would then allow the states to collect the difference between 18.4 cents per gallon and 3.7 cents per gallon, or more if they chose, but at least that difference, and collect that on their own and spend that on their own. Now, this makes perfect sense to me because that's in many respects roughly how the money is spent anyway. It's just that this would get rid of the federal filter, where we take it to Washington, we run it through Washington's special black box, and then we distribute it back out based on some formula. But when we distribute it back out, we send it back to the states with a huge pile of regulations. Davis-Bacon wages, for example, and all kinds of NEPA requirements. And that ends up costing us, by some estimates, about 18%. Some say that that is a lowball figure, but 18% is, I think, a fairly safe figure of what we could save by just letting the states do this on their own. They could create a whole lot more infrastructure with that same amount of money. They could do more with less. That ultimately translates to more affordable housing. That ultimately translates to moms and dads being able to spend less time stuck in gridlock traffic getting to and from work and more time with their kids, and that's good for America.
One down in the front right now.
Do I need to stand or can I just?
You can sit. You better.
Hi, my name is Whitney Tipton. I stayed up with you for the filibuster, and I thank you very much for doing that. My question is, it was kind of horrifying to see your colleagues making comments negative, before, during, after that. That dynamic in the Senate right now, how does that affect this path to 1980?
It is exactly why we need the path to 1980, because the environment, the toxicity that you just described, could become paralyzing if we allow it to be, could become paralyzing if we dwell on that, and if we fail in dwelling on that to identify what we're for and to unite people behind certain things that we can be for and push for. And so that's exactly why I say there's this hole in the party, a gap between the base and what some would call the establishment. And it is exactly the size and shape of a conservative reform agenda. And I think this is exactly why we're doing that. So far, the response within the party has been good. And I look forward to continuing to pitch that because I do think we have to have that. Remember, in 1976, we had a lot of people dissembling within the party, and that was unfortunate. It would have been tragic if we had allowed that dynamic to persist and stop us from doing what we did in 1980 and in subsequent years.
We have one right down here in the front.
By the way, speaking of the filibuster, last night I had the toughest time when you're doing those all-nighters is sort of the maybe the 3 to 4 in the morning range.
That was actually pretty good.
Last night, yeah, that was some of our best material though, because I turned to Ted and I said, Ted, this is going to be the toughest time of the night, and we got to sort of energize ourselves in this. And I said, and that can mean only one thing. Yes, we're talking about the Commerce Clause. So last night, I got assigned, we got a lot of things going on related to the, let's say, the post-nuclear era in the Senate. And for a variety of reasons, we had to take turns manning the floor all night, and I was assigned the awesome time of 3 to 4 a.m. And they told us, you don't have to speak. You just go there and make sure they don't do anything and object to whatever they do, but you can talk if you want to. But I'm a senator, so naturally I got there, and it's what we do. We talk. So I had another late night last night talking about stuff. It was a lot of fun.
Hi. Make sure this is on. Is it on? Okay. Debbie Rivera, first of all, I want to thank you and all your colleagues who do truly represent your constituents, and I really, really, really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Here's a question, and it's been a tough one for me, and I hope it's not too tough for you, but yes, we want to uphold our Constitution. If we don't, we're done. But what happens when our political leadership doesn't follow the Constitution? What can be done with that? What are the repercussions for that? I know Senator Paul has been thinking about this, and he is trying desperately hard to find a way to have these people stop and to, have them reap the consequences. Your thoughts?
Yeah, before I answer, I want to make sure that I'm addressing the type of constitutional violation you're talking about. Is there any specific type, or you just want me to cover the gamut? Because we got a lot of unconstitutional stuff going on. So
I was going to say, pick a winner, pick a person.
Okay.
But let's start at the top.
Okay, start at the top. I assume that means the President of the United States. Okay, so we got a problem. We've got a big problem. We've got a president who has openly flouted the Constitution on a number of occasions. Let me just pick a few. You've got January 4th, 2012. He makes 4 recess appointments. Only one problem: we're not in recess at the time he makes those appointments. And in fact, just 24 hours earlier, we had opened the second session of the 112th Congress. This is the first time in American history any president has ever dared to purport to make a recess appointment at a time we're not in recess. And yet he boldly stood behind it. This is an example, one of many, in which the president has acted unconstitutionally, and too many in Congress have been inclined to do what many Americans have become inclined to do, which is say, oh, constitutional violation. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see if the courts do something about it. Well, the court that they're relying on, the big court at the top, is the same court that rewrote Obamacare, not just once, but twice, in order to save it. Rewrote it, and itself openly flouted the Constitution. If you read Article 3, there is no power vested in the court to legislate. No power vested in the court to make alterations to legislation that it deems unconstitutional absent those alterations, and yet it made them twice. Once in rewriting a penalty as a tax, and another time writing into the Medicaid expansion provisions an opt-out choice, an opt-out option for the states. They did that in order to avoid having to get into the severability analysis, which would have culminated in the court saying, with this hole in the ship, the whole ship has to sink. That's what the court does in severability analysis. When you take this part out, does the ship sail or does it sink? Well, this one would have sunk. That's why they wrote that in. So it's one of the many reasons why I say you can't just wait for the courts to fix it, because the courts themselves have been openly flouting the Constitution. Not in every case, but in this one they did, and in others they have. Moreover, there are many, many instances in which the court is ill-equipped to deal with certain types of constitutional violations. Take, for example, what the president did on July 2nd of this year, when the president said, I'm going to, of course, go ahead and implement and enforce the individual mandate, but I will not be implementing or enforcing the employer mandate. This was a brazen political move. It was craven, and it was utterly unconstitutional because he rewrote Obamacare yet again. Nothing in Article 2 gives the President of the United States the power to do that. There again, many people said, well, let the courts worry about it. Let the courts deal with that. Well, there's a problem with that. Not sure anybody can establish Article 3 standing to challenge that, because you've got to show that you've got an injury in fact fairly traceable to the conduct of the defendant that can be remedied by the court. There are a variety of reasons why I don't think anybody can establish standing there, and even if they did, the case would probably be rendered moot before the time was up, because we're talking about a one-year window before this alteration becomes a thing of the past, at least in theory. And so that's why, and a lot of the same comments were made when the president made these unconstitutional recess appointments. Let's let the courts worry about it. This is why I've been saying we have to make the Constitution the topic of constant political discussion and dialogue, not just in the courts. This is not just a document for the courts. This is a document for all three branches. And this document and an understanding of it and a commitment to embrace it, to uphold it, to protect it, to defend it, it has to be part of any and every conservative's political platform. And so one of the questions that we've got to start asking our candidates when they run, whether they're incumbents or whether they're challengers, whether they are running for the first time or for the last time, it's got to be, what are your views on the Constitution, and what are your views on what you will do when you see the Constitution violated? Will you wait for the courts? Or when you're asked to vote on something that you know the Founding Fathers could never have looked at and said, yeah, that's within the power of the federal government, will you vote for it even though the courts are likely to acquiesce, as they almost always do, under the Commerce Clause and under the Spending Clause? Anyway, it's a long-winded answer to a very important question, and I wish we had even more time to get into it. But the bottom line is the only way that we're going to be able to deal with this open flouting of the Constitution is to make it not just for the courts. It is a political issue, and it has to be. And you know what? It always was. For the first 150 years of our republic, the Constitution was part of the national political dialogue. You actually did have presidents of the United States vetoing legislation because they thought it was unconstitutional. And they didn't stop and think, well, I think the courts probably would end up giving their blessing. You never saw a signing statement saying, I think this might be unconstitutional in part, but I will sign it anyway and let the courts work that out. That has happened, of course, in recent years. Some of our own guys have done that. I'm not going to name names, but it has happened. That has to stop, because there are so many instances in which, for a variety of practical and legal reasons, the courts won't be able to get into it. And so if we find that our own people, our own senators and our own representatives, regardless of which party they're in, are not willing to stand up for it, then they need to be held to account for that. They need to either change course, or they need to perhaps be replaced by others who will more aggressively and sincerely step in and defend the Constitution. Let me, and I'm sorry this answer has gone on too long, but this is exactly why I felt it so imperative to outline. It was on July 2nd, right after the President made that announcement, that I looked at that. I looked at it from every angle. I tried to figure out a solution to it. The only thing I could come up with was a solution that was roughly contemplated by James Madison in Federalist 58. The only power Congress has in that circumstance, short of doing something much more drastic, which we won't get into because that's just not going to happen in this political environment, the only political option Congress has is to use its spending power to respond to an overstep of constitutional authority. The only tool we had at our disposal at that point was to say, if the President says this law is not ready to be implemented, if the President himself says the law is not going to be implemented, that he won't follow it, then we have to refuse to fund his implementation of that law. And in order to do that, we had to try to separate Obamacare funding from funding for everything else. And so my response to that was simple. Let's pass something. Maybe it's one continuing resolution, maybe it's a series of them. Pass something that funds everything else in government, even programs that I hate. I'll be willing to do that in order to separate out legislation that funds Obamacare. And then let's have a separate debate and discussion about funding for Obamacare. Obamacare needs to be funded or not funded on its own merits and not on the merits of defense or national parks or veterans benefits or cancer research or anything else. It needs to stand on its own merits. Now, for that very simple statement, I was attacked by the left, and I was attacked by many within my own party for wanting to shut down the government. That is insane. That is absurd. It is a lie, and it was a lie that was perpetuated in part by the media, in part by the political establishment of both parties. And it is a lie that most Americans still believe, that I wanted to shut down the government. That is exactly the opposite of what I wanted. The shutdown was unfortunate, it was unnecessary, it was avoidable. I did everything I could to avoid it, but the president wouldn't move 1 inch. He wouldn't compromise, he wouldn't negotiate. Even as we moved backwards, we went from indefinite defunding to 1-year defunding. We went from funding everything else but Obamacare to just funding defense, just funding cancer research, just funding veterans benefits, just funding national parks. He wouldn't have any of it. He wouldn't negotiate, he wouldn't compromise. Yet the liberal media, which is itself a redundant term, perpetuated this lie. Now look, folks, we're in a world of hurt, if that's the world in which we now live. If the world in which we now live is one in which we as Republicans have to vote for any and every spending bill that the Democrats want to shove down our throats, even a horrible program like Obamacare has to be funded, and we have to go along with it, or else all of a sudden we are the people who shut down the government. So we've got to expose that lie for what it is. And look, I know that one is behind us, but we'll have more CR battles in front of us, and we've got one coming right now. We've got to expose that lie, because if we don't, we will find ourselves at the receiving end of this very nasty cycle where we just have to pass whatever they tell us we have to pass, or else we get accused of shutting down the government.
We have a couple back here. Let's start back here first. In the back.
Jordan Long, the Heritage Foundation. Could Congress pass any legislation that would influence standing and broaden it?
Yes, it can. There are some limits to our ability to expand Article 3 standing, but we can expand it significantly. We've done it in other areas. It raises a variety of questions of which constitutional violations. We'd probably have to do that on a point-by-point basis, meaning we'd have to identify particular constitutional violations and then come up with a remedy and then identify who the plaintiff could be. But yeah, there are things we could look at there.
Let's take this one up here.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank you for, during the government shutdown, standing with our veterans and coming out on a Sunday morning in the rain at the U.S. Capitol with a huge rally of veterans from all over the country who were standing up against the fact that their memorials were being blockaded and shut down. So I just want to give a shout out because many people won't know that you did that. I'm grateful.
I'd actually like to ask the last question if I could. I know in the audience we have quite a few Heritage Foundation interns and other college students, and we work mainly with college students at the Clare Boothe Luce Institute, and they just face an incredible amount of left-wing bias on their campuses from professors, from administrators and faculty, and I just wondered if you had a few words of encouragement to them that you would like to give.
If you can survive college in America, I mean, look, it's a win-win. If you happen to go to Hillsdale, you're going to be great. If you happen to go pretty much anywhere else other than Hillsdale, you will be bombarded throughout your college experience with left-wing propaganda. And it'll be good preparation for the rest of your life. So either way, it's a win-win. Go to college. If you're one of the lucky ones at Hillsdale, they'll supply you with the opposing side so that you'll know what to do with it. And the interesting thing about Hillsdale is that Hillsdale is the place where you actually do get both sides. And in America, we call that a rabidly foaming at the mouth conservative institution because they give you both sides. The law school version of that is that when you go to any kind of law school or legal symposium, it's totally left-wing socialist propaganda, unless it's a forum produced by the Federalist Society, for example. And the difference between a Federalist Society legal symposium and any other is that in the Federalist Society symposia, you will have both sides represented. So if you are a conservative and you're here, or you're hearing my voice, you know why you're a conservative. Stick to your principles, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And if your professors get mad at you, remind them that you're in an academic environment. It's in the academic laboratory in which we're supposed to ask questions. And if they get mad at you, that just means you're doing your job. And so, look, weather through it. And then, if you carry deep scars with you after you get through with it and you resent it, channel that resentment by going into academia or politics or journalism or any of the other countless institutions that are dominated by left-wing socialists.
As is our tradition, we have a couple of small gifts for the senator that meet all the legal requirements, Brian, don't worry. What do you have here?
Of course. We have, of course, our limited edition Claire Booth Luce Policy Institute coffee mug with her famous saying, "No good deed goes unpunished," which I know you know to be true. And one more
I
gift.
have drank from this bitter cup many times and look forward to doing so.
And one more gift you could probably share with all those sisters that you have, our new 2014 Great American Conservative Woman Calendar to hang in your office.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And from the Heritage Foundation, we have a small token. You know, we think of you as a fusionist. I know that there are some people here who don't know what that is. Well, you need to find out. But one of the fathers of modern conservatism who coined the term fusionism was Frank Meyer, who was at the National Review with Bill Buckley and Bill Rusher, and they understood that economic conservatives and social conservatives are two sides of the same coin, and they need to be defended by a strong national defense. So we're going to give you this book, In Defense of Freedom by Frank Meyer, a little light reading for the holidays. Thank you so much. Thank you all very much. We have lunch for you across the lobby, and Senator, keep up the fight. We really do appreciate all you're doing.
Thank you.
Bless you. Yeah.